you. But my question is, you are a wonderful dad and a grandfather, but you grew up without a dad. What did that mean for you? Who filled that role?
Well, first of all, my father was killed in a car wreck about 3 months before I was born. And then my mother, when I was about not quite 2, she moved in with her parents but left me to go back to New Orleans to finish her nursing education. So I had my grandfather and my great uncle had a big role in that, and did until for the rest of their lives. And then when my mother remarried, my stepfather did when he was all right. He had a drinking problem, but I loved him nonetheless, and he was quite good when he was okay. But I learned about what it's like to live, with somebody with an addiction in a family. And then I always had other people who were willing to help me. But the main thing is that every kid needs somebody who makes her or him feel like they're the most important person in the world. And you can break all kinds of rules about who that person is, but if somebody who's steady makes you believe that you are the most important person in the world, you can probably make it. And you can be a zillionaire. And if you never meet anybody that makes you feel like you're the most important person in the world, including caring enough to keep you in line when you need to be helped to be raised, it doesn't work very well. So I had a very rich upbringing. My grandfather and grandmother loved me. My grandmother's brother, whom I adored, and his wife loved me. And my mother came home when I was 4, and I had a fascinating life. And when Hillary ran for president in 2016, my sainted grandfather, who had a 6th grade education, was still getting her votes and had been dead since the late 50s. So I'm on a little bus campaigning for Hillary, and this says a lot about my upbringing. It says I'm campaigning for Hillary in Ohio, and I come to this town, and there's an African-American minister there. I could tell he had a cross around his neck. And I got out to shake his hand, and he said, before you say anything, he said, I'm for Hillary. I've always been for Hillary, and I was for you twice, and don't give me a thought to that. I'm Bishop Stewart. I said, why? He said, because for your purposes, the only thing that matters is that I am the proud grandson of Luther Black of Hope, Arkansas. And when you ran for president, my grandfather called me and said, Luther, after the war, into the early 50s, all the people, the African Americans in our little town, we lived behind the cemetery, and we bought food from Bill Clinton's grandfather. And there were no food stamps, there was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid, there was no nothing. He said, and lots of times we worked and didn't get paid. And one day I was in that store, and he saw me looking at the food, and he said, Luther, you need to feed your children, don't you? You don't have any money. He said, no, Mr. Gatsby, I work, but I didn't get paid. He said, take what you need, sign in for it. If you can ever pay for it, come back and pay me. And he said, and this guy, I'm standing on the side of the road in 2016 in Ohio, talking about something that happened in 1950, about a man who died in 1957. And tears were streaming down my face. He said, my grandfather said, my grandfather Luther said, he said, if that governor is half the man his grandfather was, he'll be a great president. You gotta be fair. Now, because because I really hate all this. Not on the level, turning everybody into a two-dimensional cartoon. Let me see who I can badmouth and demean and belittle today. You know, to me, life was about people like my grandfather with a sixth grade education who still had the admiration of a black bishop on a street in a town in faraway Ohio because he fed his grandfather and his grandfather's children when neither my grandfather nor that man had any real money. And we have to try. I was raised with that. My great uncle lost his wife to Alzheimer's, but for 2 months, we've been friends for 50 years, 2 months, she was in a little nursing home because their house had gas heating and she was fixing to blow the house up. And we had this, in this little town where I grew up, we had this little nursing home that was connected to the hospital. So for 2 months, she'd know who she was for 15 minutes a day. And she'd call my uncle and she'd say, Orrin, we've been married 56 years and you stick me in this darn nursing home. That's not, she didn't say darn. And she said, and leave me here, get over here right now and take me home. And for 2 months, he drove over there in his late 70s, early 80s by then, early 80s every day. And by the time he got there, she was lost in the mists of her memory again. But he did it. So, in the middle of all this, I went to see him. I was governor, and I worshiped this guy. And Lord, he was smart and good. And the only time in my life we had 50 years of our lives together, we shared. The only time I ever saw him cry was when I got up to go home. I said, I got to go see Hillary and Chelsea. And I turned around, he was crying. And I said, this is really hard, isn't it? And he smiled. He said, yeah, it is. But I signed on for the whole load. And most of it was pretty good. Now, why am I telling you this? Because I am worried about America living in denial of things like climate change, but even more in denial of basic human decency. And if life is nothing more, if life is nothing more than a struggle for naked power, it's bound to have a disappointing end. You know, I've got more yesterdays than tomorrows, but I'm very grateful for however many I got left. And I wish Hillary were president and think she should have been. I think she probably would. But what I really care about is her future. And I think we're making ourselves small for no good reason. You see, the other day we had the first picture of a black hole. You see it? So it's 55 million light years away, and I'm reading up on all this stuff. One of the things I did in my dotage after I got out of politics is try to figure out physics. And so I read, I know, for example, that there are now 1 billion galaxies, give or take, in a universe that is rapidly expanding, and that this 55 million light years away is a long way from the Milky Way, but that if our entire solar system happened to sashay by that black hole, it would be sucked in like that because the magnetic power is so great. And this little Earth that we occupy, where we fight over every little drop in our identity politics, according to what the analysis I read said, would be immediately turned into a pile of dirt that would fit in a thimble. In a thimble. That's how powerful it is. And I ask myself all the time, what's going to happen of our kids if they spend all their time fighting over all their differences that don't amount to a hill of beans, when genetically we're over 99.5% the same, in a world where there's 1 billion galaxies, and we are just so privileged that we got human life and consciousness and a conscience on this little speck that can be turned into a thimble if we fall into a black hole. Why in the living hell are we wasting our lives with all this nickel and dime stuff? Why don't we save the world from climate change, do all this other stuff. Now, you may think that's naive and silly, but I think it makes good sense. Yeah, so I will just say this, you can tell I wasn't too pleased about the way Hillary was treated in the last campaign, but I'll tell you this, what I think is more important is how all of you keep score. Because no matter what happens to us, we're going to leave this planet ahead. And so are you. We've had good lives, haven't we, Ted? We had lives that we never could have imagined. So whatever happens, we leave ahead. But the only thing that really matters is how you keep score with your life. Somebody says, how will you measure whether you feel your life is worth living? Our family's motto is pretty clear. Always get caught trying. So you can say people are better off when you quit than when you start. So you can say the kids have a brighter future. And so you can say we're putting things together, not tearing them apart. The rest is background music. That's what I think about. That's my family, that's my story, that's my cigar.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's interesting that you said that everybody needs to have somebody that thinks the world of them. And I've had the privilege of standing next to you frequently when you're talking and meeting people. And you literally make everyone you meet feel like you are focused on them in that moment and think the world of them. And it's not a gimmick, you really do. And I really admire that in you. Hillary, I knew your mother, Dorothy, had the privilege of dancing with her on many occasions. Yes, you're right about that. My wife says that what has motivated Hillary Clinton to do much of what you have done in your life is to try to fix your mother's childhood by lifting up children whose childhoods are challenging. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about your mother, and also, if you don't mind, telling that story about the train trip to California. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. There we are with you and Mary. It's my mom with Ted and Mary. You know, I think Mary, who is a dear, dear friend, is so right because, you know, when I was a little girl, I didn't have any idea about the life that my mother had led. But as I became a teenager and then late teen, early 20s, young adult, I understood what a really difficult upbringing she had had, and I was just so upset and so hurt for her. For a little girl who was born to two very young parents in Chicago who had never gotten the love and the attention, the guidance and support that little kids are supposed to get because her parents were just too young. They didn't understand the responsibility of parenting, and they neglected her. They left her alone in a little apartment up the flights of stairs in a poor part of Chicago. And just the image that I always had of her once I learned this was just incredibly poignant. I remember she told me once that her parents had left and they knew they were going to be gone overnight. Left her all alone. She was probably like 3, she recalled, maybe 4, but not any older. And they gave her a coupon, and they said, when you're hungry, go down the stairs and out the door and to the corner restaurant and give them the coupon, they'll give you some money. I mean, the idea, or they give some food, the idea that you would do that to any little kid was just beyond my comprehension. Well, eventually she had a little sister born, and that was just too much for the young parents, and so they decided to send the 2 little girls to California to live with her father's parents, who were immigrants from England. So the way they sent them was to put them all alone by themselves on a train in Chicago with my 8-year-old mother in charge of her 5-year-old daughter, and send them across the country to grandparents they had never met. And again, whenever I think about her sitting by herself, trying to take care of her little sister, trying to make sure they had something to eat on that long train journey, it just broke my heart. So Mary is right, that one of the reasons that I wanted to learn about how children develop, to understand what kids need, the kind of support and parenting that they should get, is because my mother didn't have any of that. And so for her, she lived with those grandparents, but her grandmother was incredibly mean and punished my mother all the time. And so when my mother turned about 13, she had to leave that house. She could not bear it any longer. So she got a job working as a mother's helper and living in a home of a family nearby in Alhambra. So she went to work at the age of 13, and you asked Bill about how he had people in his life after his father died. Well, for my mother, who didn't have that love and that support from her nearest family, there were people along the way who gave her some sense of her importance. Like, she told me once that in first grade back in Chicago before she left, the teacher noticed she'd never had any food. They would eat lunch in those days at their desks in the classroom. And so the teacher started bringing extra food, but she didn't embarrass my mother. She would say, well, Dorothy, I brought an extra sandwich. I don't know why I did. Would you like it? And my mother realized years later that this teacher was feeding her because her own parents didn't. And then when she went to work for this family, the mother of the family said, Dorothy, you would like to go to high school, wouldn't you? And my mother said, yes, but I have to work. And so the mother of the family said, well, if you get up early and you do your chores and you get the children in your charge ready to go to school, you can go, but you'll have to come right back. That sounds kind of harsh if you're 13, but for my mother, it was a gift. So she'd get up early and she would run to school and then come back. So I always believed that there were people along the way, even in the midst of what seemed to me to be a very trying, terrible time, that gave my mother that sense that she was important. They showed her kindness, which is something that I think we should all remember. You never know when you might be kind to somebody, what an impact it could have on their lives. So I will say that my mother really was my great inspiration, and she encouraged me in every way possible. And she also made me think about what we should try to do to make sure that all children have the chance to develop to their full potential. And I can't think of a better tribute to her than to keep trying to do that. So that's what I try to do.
I just want to, because of our life together, the story of Hillary's mother, the story of my mother and all the things we did. And I don't want to trivialize either one of them. But if you had been raised by the women who raised us, the thought that any job on earth or any opportunity on earth should be denied to any woman for any reason becomes inconceivable. Because every day, all over the world, down Dusty Pathway, you went with me to Rwanda, you remember? And and we saw orphan kids being raised by women in that little village. This is an important thing to remember. I recommend it for Democrats and other social reformers, but also brother. If people could actually see each other as people and hear these stories, it would be much harder for us to demonize and marginalize and deny women because they're women, people because of their race and immigration status, or their disabilities, or their gender identity, or whatever. Most people are pretty good. That's why humanity's still around after all this year. we need to give it back. We need to, all of us, we need to, every time we see somebody as a two-dimensional cartoon, we should develop some mental trick to pinch ourselves and remember Hillary's story about her mother. I feel, you know, I remember my mother kneeling on the side of the railroad track and weeping like a baby when I was pulling away from her in New Orleans when she was going to school and I was 3 years old. That's all I can remember about her. There's the world is full of this. Why in God's name do we spend so much time trying to demonize each other and belittle each other? I mean, that's what I think about it. It's a total, it's a dead bang loser. It may be very beneficial for an election or two, but it's a terrible way to run a society and build a future for your kids.
At risk of being a bad cop, we ran out of time 20 minutes ago. I hope you accept this as a small token of our appreciation for what you have done for us and for sharing this